Peter Deutsch, former Democratic congressman from Florida, who just announced he is endorsing Trump. Okay, first off, what did your mama say? What did your wife say? And what did your friends say?
I've gotten some negative feedback, and it sort of talks about the state of affairs in the United States, but also the fact that President Trump is not a normal politician. I mean, he doesn't act in ways that normal politicians act, and it's a strength and it's also a weakness. But at the end of the day, I think all of us have to live with ourselves and look ourselves in the mirror. And I don't think this is a close call, and I'll be voting for him on November 5th and feel very comfortable about it.
When I'm not here, I'm hosting a series on faith called One Nation Under God, and I happen to look up that you are Orthodox Jewish. Is that correct?
I don't like to label anything. I'm Jewish, and that's part of my identity. But this is not about being Jewish. It's about being American.
Okay, and so in terms of being American, what is it particularly? Is it national security? Is that the one point that is important?
I think everyone goes through a process in deciding who they're going to vote for. And I think, in my mind, the most important job that the president has is to maintain world peace and have world peace. And if we look at the 4 years of the Trump administration, we look at the 4 years of the Harris-Biden administration, there couldn't be a starker difference. And what bodes for the future in a Harris administration is dramatically worse. I think we really have an example of the Harris-Biden administration in terms of what they're dealing with Iran, very similar to Neville Chamberlain as he dealt with the Nazis before World War II. And had he been successful, I think obviously, would have been horrific for the entire world. I think we're at that level of danger with President Harris.
Do you think that there are other folks who are like you, who have been Democrats for decades, their lifetime, who are seeing this same perspective, that we can't afford to go down a path that, for so many, I mean, when it comes to national security, when it comes to our influence in foreign affairs, when it comes to immigration, they think there's an obvious choice here?
Listen, I think there's a lot of issues out there. There's a lot of issues I support President Trump versus Kamala Harris in terms of immigration policy. Obviously, it's indefensible what the Harris-Biden administration have done there. In terms of school choice, I think school choice is really the civil rights issues of the 2020s. And there are plenty of issues. But for me, again, and I can't speak for every other individual, but I hope that every American votes for President Trump. I doubt, obviously, it's not going to be every American. But if there are some issues that they're just 180 degrees difference. How President Trump dealt with Iran and how the Harris-Biden administration have dealt with Iran is 180 degrees different. As President Trump talked about during the debate, he put sanctions on, which effectively made the Iranian government close, if not at bankruptcy. And so they were not able to support their terrorist proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Biden, literally the first day he came into office, changed that and effectively has given them $100 billion, which they have spent giving to their proxies who have killed Americans directly, as well as Israelis, as well as other foreign nationals. This administration is an administration that absolutely has not been willing to use force or credible use of force in terms of stopping a rogue nation, a terrorist nation that we know has literally tried to kill, assassinate President Trump on American soil. They've tried to assassinate former Secretary of State Pompeo and former National Security Advisor Bolton. And what has the Biden administration done about that? Effectively nothing.
One more question for you, just as we're out of time, but with respect to your opinion, and other articles have cited that you really are wanting peace, that this is about the peace of the world and America. But what would your appeal be to those who say they haven't made up their mind because they're not really particularly fond of either candidate? They're not in favor of Vice President Harris or of President Trump. What would you tell them as an appeal?
Well, I will tell you that we're not voting for the queen of the festivals. or the prince of the festivals. We're voting for the leader of the free world and someone who we are going to rely upon to protect ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, and the future of the world.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.